Yep. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching this conversation about what terrorism is, about the necessity of a universal definition of the phenomenon, and about ways for governments to approach it. My name is Bart Collard from the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and I'm an author and currently a PhD candidate on Islamic terrorism at Leiden University. But first of all, it is my pleasure to be having this Zoom meeting with Professor Boaz Ganor, a terrorism expert who I really admire. He was the founder of the ICT, the International Institute for Counter Terrorism, and he is one of the leading academics in the field of CT, counterterrorism. And from September 2023 onwards, he will be the president of Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. I was a student once when I joined his program, an MA in government with a specialization in counterterrorism, and we kept a warm relationship ever since. So, Professor Ganor, dear Boaz from the Netherlands, I wish you a very warm welcome on this Zoom meeting.
Thank you very much, Bart. You were so kind in presenting me so nicely. So I need to reciprocate and practically say that you were one of my best students, not just my student. So it's really a pleasure to be hosted in this Zoom meeting with you.
Thank you very much. Are you ready to start?
Sure, definitely.
All right, let's go. So the first question I have is, as you know, there are so many different definitions of terrorism. Professionals, whether they are academics or intelligence officers or something else, they do not agree upon a common definition. And it makes one wonder why we need or could use a common definition. Isn't terrorism simply a term someone uses for phenomenon X, while another person uses it for a phenomenon that looks a bit like it? Let's call it X plus or X minus. It won't be A. Everyone has some notion of terrorism. But would you agree that universally speaking, there is no such thing as terrorism, but that there's simply a vague, and then vague, since there's no agreement, a vague notion of some kind of behavior that we call terrorism?
I'm afraid I would not agree to that statement. I do believe that we need to single out a certain phenomenon, which is called terrorism, and refer to that as such and define it as such. I do agree that unfortunately there is a huge disagreement among scholars, among decision makers, and the public at large on what is really terrorism. Everybody use or even misuse the term terrorism in order to describe different phenomena. I mean, in Israel, for example, you can read at the newspaper one day the terrorism on the road, which means car accidents. When you want actually to define a problem as a huge problem, you add the term terrorism. Criminal terrorism, too many murders in a certain community, or terrorism in the family, when you have a murder in families, in different families. Well, yes, all of those are atrocities, and definitely we need to condemn all of those phenomena, but we need to single out terrorism from other types of violent activity and other type of atrocities. It's our responsibility. It's my personal effort, as you know, trying to persuade my colleagues, scholars, decision makers from all over the world to adopt a definition and to cling to it in order to be more effective in countering terrorism.
So thank you. So do I understand correctly that, in your opinion, if people use the word terrorism for a too broad definition, that's problematic?
It's very problematic because, first of all, it's delude the phenomenon of terrorism. It's creating a confusion among the public at large and decision makers. And since I believe that terrorism is a very dangerous social phenomenon that needs to be dealt in very specific tools that are relevant for countering terrorism and not for countering other atrocities, we need, first of all, to agree on what is the phenomenon that we are dealing with.
Right, and we're about to get there. But first, let me ask you, why do we need a universal definition then? What would be the benefits of it?
Well, there are people which are saying no need for that. I mean, even for international cooperation, the CIA can work with the Israeli Mossad or the MI6 or whoever quite effectively in countering terrorism without agreeing on the specific definition and so on and so forth. I beg to differ. It's true that for a certain level of effectiveness in counterterrorism, one do not necessarily need to agree on a definition. But if you really want to have effective counterterrorism activity, for example, if you really want to fight and to contend with incitement for terrorism, how can we cooperate? How can Dutch people and Israelis or Americans or other Europeans work together in order to eradicate incitement to terrorism without agreeing on what is terrorism?
If I may interrupt, I would like to add that even within a nation, we already have it. If I look to the Netherlands, only the police, we have a national coordinator of terrorism and security, and our AIVD, our intelligence agency, they all have different definitions of what terrorism is.
It's amazing. It's amazing, and it's not just in Netherlands. We see this in United States. We see this in other countries altogether. Every agency uses a different version of a definition. Now, it might suit those agencies, but it doesn't suit the effectiveness in counterterrorism. I gave the example of countering incitement, and bear in mind that incitement is borderless. Incitement is crossing from one border to another border through social networks, the internet, and so on and so forth. You have the inciter living in one state, using an internet platform and the social network, which is being monitored in another state, and is inciting people for terrorism in a third state altogether. If those states do not agree that this information, this material, is incitement to terrorism, you would not have an effective counterterrorism activity. But this is only incitement. Think about money. Think about money transfer. How can you contend with terrorism fundraising? How do you create a situation in which banks are cooperating among each other? Yes, you can define a certain organization and agree on that. I think everybody around, not everybody, but many people around the world would agree that ISIS is a terrorist organization. So we can all agree that if there is money that is being donated to ISIS, well, banks around the world would confiscate that. But what about other organizations? We do not even agree who's a terrorist organization because we do not agree what is terrorism altogether. Is PKK a terrorist organization? Depends who you ask. Hezbollah? Depends who you ask. Chechens, militias, Houthis, and so on and so forth. It's all about your political perspective. And that's what a global accepted definition should solve. We should all agree on what is terrorism, and based on that, we can agree on what is a terrorist organization and how do we need to jointly contend with this phenomenon.
So I would say, please enlighten us. What is your definition of terrorism, the one you propose and think should be adapted in the world?
So the definition that I use is quite short and simple. By the way, in brackets, usually I say to my students, when you read the definition, which is long and have many articles and so on and so forth, you can immediately understand, even without reading that this understanding was born in order to confuse everybody. My definition is very short, precise, and in my view, objective. Terrorism is the deliberate use of violence being conducted by non-state actors against civilian targets in order to achieve political ends. By the way, think about the larger term of political ends. It includes ideologies, it includes religious political goals, and so on and so forth. But with your permission, let me explain each one of the 4 elements or 5 elements that I have in my definition. First of all, it's the use of violence. If there is no violence, it's not terrorism. Incitement to terrorism, it's not terrorism. It's a different felony. It's a felony of incitement to terrorism, but it's not terrorism. So you need to have violence, active violence in this regard. It could be huge, it could be small violence, but still violence. Second, and this is quite debatable, I seclude the phenomenon of terrorism, and I'm saying it's being conducted by non-state actors. Some of my friends, definitely some of my enemies, would say, but what about states? Are states more moral than non-state actors? Do states not conduct those types of atrocities? And the answer is, of course, not necessarily. State could be even huge states, and they can conduct huge atrocities much bigger than what a small terrorist organization can conduct. But I don't need to define those activities, and those activities, as I said, the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilian targets being conducted by states, it already has been defined by the international community, and it's being called war crimes. That's what the international humanitarian law defines as war crimes. You do not have the right to deliberately attack civilians. We will not get into the subject of proportionality and distinction, but at least on this moral, basic concept, there is a global acceptance, a global international acceptance, and I cling to that specific concept, and I'm saying if states are doing that, that's a war crime. If a non-state actors are doing that, this is terrorism, which is equivalent to war crimes. The third element is civilian targets. So from what I'm saying, one can conclude, and rightly so, that in my point of view, deliberate attacks conducted against military targets is not terrorism. It's a different political violence altogether. It's what I would refer to as guerrilla warfare, but it's not terrorism. Now, we'll talk maybe later on about this distinction, but for the time being, let's agree that in my definition, I distinct between deliberate attack against military targets and deliberate attacks against civilian targets. The third element is in order to achieve political ends. That's practically what differs terrorism from other types of criminal activity. When the perpetrator has a political goal, again, in the broader sense of the term, it differs from others that are conducting felonies in order to, I don't know what, gain money or prestige, personal prestige or something along those lines. And that's the definition practically that I would suggest to adopt.
Well, thank you. And what would you say is the main advantage of this definition over all the others?
Well, I think that the main advantage is the fact that within the definition, I practically differ between goals and means. And my definition actually emphasizes that terrorism is a certain type of modus operandi. It's a mean to achieve different goals, all of them political, ideological, religious, but we are not discussing the question of the goals. Why? Because we would never agree with the international community, would never agree what is a just cause and what is not a just cause. It depends on our culture, on our history, on our interests, and so on and so forth. So if we try to cling a definition on the concept of a just cause or not a just cause, it would never prevail. Therefore, the big advantage of this definition is that we disregard the cause. We do not need to agree if it's a just cause or not a just cause. We do agree that even if one has a just cause in his eyes, he do not have the right to deliberately attack civilians. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have the right to use violence. Under certain conditions, maybe he does, he or any other entity. But he do not have the right to deliberately attack civilians. And I think that this is the embryonic concept that the international community, which has many disputes and disagreements, on that point, we can all agree.
Yes, and you also got me thinking with that when I heard about this definition for the first time, because I remember you saying that it doesn't mean that other forms of violence are legal. No, they are even illegal. You can be punished for it. So let me ask a few questions about these elements of this definition you just mentioned. one question I sometimes get, because I teach my students your definition as well, and then we discuss it. Very, very interesting. So one of the questions I sometimes get is, what is violence? Could it also be violence against property, for example? Would that also be included or not? And I think Daniel Reisner, your friend, the lawyer, I think he mentioned it in a debate you had at the ICT conference a few years ago. What if I slap you in the face for political ends? Would that be violence, or would a threshold be needed? Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on this?
It's a fair question. It's really a fair question, but I would argue that first of all, we need to agree on the basics. This is the fine-tuning. The basic is the definition that I suggested, meaning the deliberate attacks against civilians, using violence against civilians. Now, when we are trying to fine-tune, we need to ask ourselves, okay, where do we set the bar between violence which pose any risk to the life of people, or violence against property, as you have mentioned, or very, very limited violence, even oral violence, I mean, curses and so on and so forth. So the first thing I would argue that I would exclude oral violence. It has to be an activity. Now, I would agree that different communities and different countries might put the bar, based on my definition or the definition that I suggest, put the bar in a different place. If you would ask my perspective or my observation or my recommendation, I would include all types of violence as terrorism. It could be that you have a low level of terrorism or high level or high magnitude of terrorism. It could be mass killing, a suicide attacker, car bombs, and so on and so forth. It could be not mass killing, just stabbing of one person or injuring one person. And it could be even lesser than that, injuring someone intentionally in order to achieve political goals under the definition. Or even, in my view, I would add to that severe damage to property. Definitely. Not I don't know what, painting on walls, but destroying critical infrastructure or trying to destroy that, and other types of infrastructures would be regarded, in my view, as terrorism. We need to double click on that, because some states, many states around the world, refer to a different term when we are talking about low level of violence. And instead of using the term terrorism, they use the term hate crimes. And I don't accept the term hate crime. Hate crime is terrorism. Any hate crime is terrorism. It's a low level, sometimes it's a low level of terrorism, sometimes it's even a middle level or high level of terrorism, but in many cases it could be low level of terrorism. But this is terrorism because hatred is not the motive, it's the outcome of the motive. The hatred is against Jews, it's against Muslims, it's against immigrants, it's against the others, and so on and so forth. And that's based on ideology, political ideology, and therefore it's terrorism. Hatred is an outcome of extremism or extremist ideologies.
I think that makes sense. What I always think is very complicated is all these countries have different notions, again, of course, of what is hatred and when do you incite to hatred. But I think it makes sense because usually there is a political end behind it. It's not, hey, let's hate the Jews, so let's hate the Jews. No, you want to do something with that. So thank you for explaining this. What I was wondering is, if we want an international consensus, you already mentioned some of your friends and enemies, they won't agree with your phrase, non-state actors. What I sometimes hear is, yes, but definitely some governments with Islamist countries with Islamist governments, they would not they would not agree upon non-state actors being terrorism only. because they might want to include the State of Israel as a terrorist organization.
Definitely, and this is a very good example how people, entities, and governments might misuse the term terrorism for that purpose. I want to, with your permission, I want to read a small section from the definition of terrorism that was adopted by the Muslim World League in South Africa in 2001, immediately after 9/11 atrocity. They needed to start some kind of a discussion among the Muslim world, because there was no doubt who's responsible for this biggest terrorist attack ever in United States. And for that purpose, they understood that they need to start from the question, what is terrorism? So I already told you that when I see long definitions, I immediately understand that there is a problem there. If my definition holds 2 or 3 lines, their definition holds 3 pages.
Yes.
So I want, please, Bart.
Please finish it within the hour, reading the definition.
Yeah, that's why I said, so I won't bother you with all definition. I would just take one article.
Go ahead.
It explains everything. And I quote, terrorism is an outrageous attack carried out either by individual groups or states against the human being. And then they explain, against his religion, life, intellect, property, and honor. I mean, I can include everything I want in this definition. If you insult my intellect by saying something stupid in this interview, this is terrorism under this definition. But you never gave any stupid argument, so I'm not worried about it. And they add to that, it includes all forms of intimidation, harm, threatening, killing, and here's the punchline, without a just cause. So if you so-called have a just cause, you can do all of the above. You can kill, you can insult, you can destroy, you can do whatever you want because you have a just cause. And that's actually is the essence of the misleading of this definition and many other definitions. The definition of terrorism should not ever refer to what is a just cause and what is not a just cause, because on that we would never agree.
No, it's too
going back to Israel, if you want, I would refer to Israel. So those states do not accept the right of Israel to exist. Any attack against the Israeli entity in order to eradicate the state, it's a just cause. That's not terrorism. Here it's as simple as that.
Yeah, it's too subjective.
Exactly.
Thank you for this. So the third part I wanted to talk about shortly is civilian targets. Some questions we always handle in class, we always treat in class is a police officer a civilian? Maybe military personnel when they're off duty. What about a diplomat? Or yeah, there's a lot of things you can think about. So what would your because I sort of agree on what you say. First, let's get agreement on the basis, and then we focus on filling in the blanks. But if you were the one, dictator Boaz, what would you decide upon?
Well, I would like to refer again to what I've said before, by arguing that your question now goes back to the fine-tuning of the definition. I didn't succeed even to persuade about the big concept of differing between civilians and military targets, and now you are pinpointing, and rightly so, sub-questions that fine-tune. Where do we really draw the line of what is a civilian target and what is not? Again, I would accept here that there would be different interpretations. It doesn't necessarily delude the importance of the definition that I suggest. And I would understand that some countries would add police to civilian targets, and others would refer to that as military targets. I mean, you have even a bigger problem. What about military police, which we have in different countries as an entity by itself? In my view, and you asked my view about it, my take on that is that police targets are civilian targets, i.e. any attack against police targets would be terrorism and not guerrilla warfare, because police is aimed to establish law enforcement activity and to regulate the activity within the state. It's a force that is aimed against any criminal activity, including terrorism, that's true, but any criminal activity, and therefore attacking that specific force would be, in my view, a terrorist activity, unlike soldiers or other types of military targets.
Okay, thank you. So, having debated this for many years, because correct me if I'm wrong, but is it the Counterterrorism Puzzle? Is that the book where you introduce this for the first time?
Actually, I introduced that in an article before, but within my 4 books, that was the first book that I referred to that. Yes.
So what year was the article?
It was called, the title was, Is One Man Terrorist, Is Another Man Freedom Fighter. That was the title of the article.
And when was it published? In what year?
Late 80s or early 90s, something like that.
So you've been debating this for a very long time.
Yes. Actually, I made a whole career on this debate, I have to admit.
So what is the strongest argument you find against your definition?
Well, there are a few strong arguments against my definition. I refute all of them, but they're good. One, especially in Israel, is an argument that's saying that by differing between military target and civilian targets and setting a moral difference between those two types of violent activities, I sacrifice soldiers. I sacrifice military targets, which is wrong. I do not say that deliberate attack against civilians are forbidden and deliberate attack against military target are permitted. I'm saying that there is a moral difference between the two. But from a state that is suffering from both, like Israel, from my point of view, anyone who attacks my soldiers is my enemy. And I have all the right in the world to fight back and if necessary to kill him before he's killing my soldiers. So I'm not deluding any right of the state to defend itself from any type of violence, if it's guerrilla or it's terrorism altogether. But I do cling to the international agreement of the international humanitarian law that says that as states do not have the right to deliberately attack civilians, also non-state actors should not have the right to deliberately attack civilians. From that, you can learn that they might have the right to attack military targets, that's fine, but the victim actually would refer to them as enemies and would fight back. I would argue that anybody who fights my soldier is my enemy, but it's not necessarily the enemy of the rest of the world. But anybody who deliberately attack my civilians, anybody who deliberately attack childs in the kindergarten, or people in a mosque or in a synagogue, becomes an enemy of the whole world because it actually do not accept the international norms altogether. That's a very important distinction between terrorism and guerrilla altogether. So that's one criticism. Another criticism that I find dealing with is that especially practitioners are saying, look, the whole discussion that you are leading here is an academic drill, meaning there's no real essence in reality. Why? Because the terrorists do not have this debate. They do not care. From their point of view, take Israel, for example, all the Israelis are soldiers. If it's a 3-year-old boy, he will grow up and become a soldier. That's why he should be regarded as a soldier. If it's elderly people, he used to serve in the army, therefore we should refer to him as a soldier, and so on and so forth. So they do not distinguish between civilians and soldiers. So why should we burden ourselves with the question of is a deliberate attack against this or that? My answer is that it's true, but it's not the terrorists to blame that they do not distinguish between those targets. It's us, the international community, to blame. Why? Because we didn't challenge them. I mean, if you're a terrorist, regardless where you are, you know that if you deliberately attack civilians, you will probably, it will be easier for you because you will not have to deal with overcoming soldiers or military compounds and so on and so forth. You know that you will probably gain more media attention as an outcome of that. And you know that if you will be captured, you will be punished in the same way, regardless if you deliberately attack civilians or deliberately attack military targets. You will get the same punishment. So from a rational point of view, why not attacking civilians? It's easier and it's more effective from their point of view. We need to change that. We need to give different emphasis to deliberate attack against civilians. We need to make it very clear to them that the cost that they would have to pay internationally wise, not just in the country, but internationally wise, the lose of any political support for the cause as an outcome of deliberate attack against civilians, this is a cost that they should not pay. So we don't tell them don't use violence. If you want to use violence, do it. You might get costs for that, but do it. Do not deliberately attack civilians because the cost for that will be much higher and will be counterproductive for you.
And it's the worst behavior they could do.
Exactly, the worst.
All right. So with these words, I wish to conclude the first part of our conversation. So everyone, thank you for watching, and we see you in the second part.